Hello, and thank you for watching this webinar on autism and visual support. My name's Emily Pearson. I'm an outreach teacher with Send Success, who are the SEN outreach team in Waltham Forest. So today, we're going to have a quick recap of what autism is. It's something many of you may already be familiar with. You may have already attended autism training in the past and have some sense, some understanding of what autism is. You may not. So we're going to start with a quick recap of what we mean by autism, just so that we all have a shared understanding of what we mean when we're talking about autism, because that will help us when looking ahead and understanding reasons for using visual support with autistic children and young people. And then alongside those reasons, we're going to look at some examples of the types of visual support that you might see, that you might use. As you're watching this webinar, you may well have a child in mind or children in mind who you are currently working with or have worked with in the past. Now, as we look ahead and we look at different reasons and different examples of visual support that you might use with autistic children and young people, we're obviously not going to be able to provide an exhaustive, completely comprehensive list. But what you may get from this session, what I hope you get from this session, is some inspiration, some ideas, some examples of the type of thing you might take away and adapt to use with the children and young people that you are working with. So, what is autism? I'll start by showing you a picture of a bus. So this bus was in Seattle in 2013, and there was an advert on the side of the bus. This is from the Seattle Children's Hospital. Now, the advert on the side of this bus was not on the side of this bus for very long. There was a bit of a backlash against this from many members of the autistic community and their carers and supporters. What they did not like, quite understandably, is the idea that autism is a disease, that autism is something that we should seek to cure and wipe out in the same way that we are seeking to cure and wipe out cancer and diabetes. And this is part of a movement very much driven by the autistic community to understand autism as a difference, as a different way of perceiving and understanding the world, of experiencing the world, not as a deficit, not as a series of things that an autistic person cannot do in relation to a non-autistic person. So what are these differences? The Autism Education Trust talks about 3 areas of difference, 3 key areas of difference. So autistic people may have some differences in social understanding and communication. They may have differences in flexibility, information processing and understanding, and in their sensory processing and integration. What we'll do now is spend a few minutes just having a quick look at each of these areas in turn, before moving on to looking at some reasons and examples of using visual support to support autistic children and young people. So there may be differences in social understanding and communication. So there may be differences in the way that an autistic person may perceive or interpret all of those kind of unwritten social rules and behaviours that we're all expected to follow. There may be differences in understanding and using non-verbal communication. A big example there is eye contact. Everyone has their own very individual preferences on how they use and understand eye contact. Understanding the thoughts, actions and feelings of others. There may be differences in the way those everyday interactions are carried out. So yeah, small talk, chatting, that kind of thing. And there may be differences in understanding and responding to instructions and explanations, particularly in relation to processing time. So the time needed to receive instructions, receive explanations, and the time it takes to process those and understand those. So there can be differences in flexibility, information processing, and understanding. And there's a list of examples of what that may look like here on the slide. As you read through these, some of them may be familiar. You may recognise some of these in some of the children and young people that you work with. So there can be a tendency to focus on details rather than the bigger picture. There can be a difficulty or a difference in understanding what's happening throughout the day, what's happening that day, what's happening that week. There can be differences in managing changes to routine, managing transitions. That can be big transitions from primary to secondary school, for example, or that can be small transitions from completing one piece of work to finishing it and moving on to the next piece of work. And a lot of the children and young people that we work with have special or sometimes called intense interests. And I've put a picture of Greta here because I think it's important that we all remember that this isn't always a negative thing. I think it's very easy when we're talking about autism to get hung up on all the negative things, to get hung up on all the difficulties, to get hung up on all the problems that this can cause. And actually, I think it's really important that we celebrate some strengths, that we remember and celebrate and promote all the positive that can come from autism. And I think Greta is a great example of that. And there can be differences in sensory processing. And this is an area that can have a profound effect on an autistic person's mental health and well-being and on their day-to-day lives and behaviour. We don't have time to talk about this in great depth today, but we're talking about 8 different senses when we're talking about sensory processing. We're talking about vision, so sight, auditory, hearing, olfactory, smell, tactile, touch, and gustatory, taste. So they're the kind of 5 senses that we all learnt about in school. But we're also talking about 3 lesser known senses. So the vestibular system, which is about movement, particularly movement of the head in relation to gravity. We're talking about proprioception, which is about awareness of where your body is in space. And we're talking about interoception, which is about understanding and awareness of what's going on inside your body. So whether you are hungry, whether you are in pain, whether you need to go to the toilet, for example. And what we see in a great majority of autistic people is differences in the way that these senses are experienced and processed. So in each and any of these senses separately, there can be a hypersensitivity and oversensitivity to the information that sense is receiving, or there can be a hyposensitivity and undersensitivity to the information that's coming in via that sense. And this can change and fluctuate in the short and the long term. So it can be very, very important to have a sense and an understanding of the sensory processing differences experienced by the children and young people that you're working with. So this understanding of the 3 areas of difference comes together quite nicely in this iceberg metaphor, whereby what we see on the surface, the behaviour that we see in our children and young people, is just the tip of the iceberg. It's just what we can see on the surface. There can be so much going on underneath the surface to do with their autism that we can't see, and we have to think very carefully about and do our best to understand and discover. So here are some examples of the sorts of things that might be going on. So an inability to predict, not understanding what's happening, experiencing sensory overload. Changes to routine can be very, very inherently stressful. Changes to expectation, and seeking out social interaction, seeking out social connection, but not understanding quite how to do that with non-autistic people. So this is where using visual supports can come into its own. Using visual support can really help bring down anxiety. It can help provide structure, it can help provide predictability. It can open up a means of communication, open up those channels of communication between people. And it can promote positive mental health and well-being in a lot of our autistic children and young people. So as I said before, when we're going through now looking at reasons and examples of visual supports, again, it will not be an exhaustive list, but hopefully it will provide you with some inspiration, some ideas to take away and adapt. So before we get started, here's a really strong take-home message. It's taken from the National Autistic Society's Stories from the Spectrum. When Ellie here, an autistic young woman, was asked, what could the public do to support you in social situations? Her response was simply to speak slower and have pictures. So before we get started, it's important to point out that we need to be careful when we choose which visual support to use with our children and young people. There is no point using visual support if the child you're working with doesn't understand it. And in fact, it can be counterproductive and cause further stress, greater stress, which of course is the exact opposite of what we're trying to do. Now, the visual support that we might use can be organised in this hierarchy here, where at one end we've got the most concrete representation of the thing we're trying to express, up to the most abstract representation of that same thing. So at its most concrete, we have objects of reference, whereby we use an object to represent an activity or a place. So for example, you may show a child a plate to show them that it's time for lunchtime, that it's time to go to the dinner hall. Next, we have photographs, very specific photographs of objects or things or activities. Moving on to coloured pictures. So with the examples here, for example, the coloured picture of the drink requires an understanding that that picture represents a broad concept. That picture represents drink, which can be a cup of water, it can be a cup of squash, it could be a bottle of water. But that picture represents a broad concept, which requires a certain level of cognitive ability and understanding. Next, we move on to symbols, which may be black and white. And finally, the written word. Now, of course, the written word, being able to decode and take meaning from a written word, requires a high level of understanding. It's important to note that it's not necessarily the case that as our children and young people get older, that they naturally move through this hierarchy of visuals. Some of our older learners will still require pictures, will still require photographs, and some of our younger learners will be able to understand, firstly read and decode, and then understand that a word represents something. So it's just another example of how our visual support needs to be tailored to meet the needs of the child we're working with. And most importantly, they need to be able to understand it. I think it's also worth noting here that the need and the usefulness of visual support doesn't necessarily go down as a child gets older. So just because a child is now in secondary school doesn't necessarily mean that they don't need the same sort of visual support that they had in primary school. It just might be that that visual support needs to be adapted to meet their needs as they grow older. So for example, an older child may not be comfortable having pictures and symbols out all over their desk. They may be increasingly aware of their peers and not want to look different or babyish. And so we may need to adapt their visual support into a more written form to make them feel more comfortable with it. But once again, they do need to be able to understand it. So why? Why use visual support? Here's a first example. So visual support, in this case a visual timetable, can help an autistic child know what is happening, what the expectations are, what's happening next, and when it will finish. When will they be done with work? When will they get access to their special interests? When will they get choosing time? When will it be lunchtime? When do they get to go home? And of course, providing this structure, this predictability can really help lower anxiety levels. So here are other examples of what a visual timetable may look like. As you can see, some of this can be typed up on a computer, it can be laminated symbols on a Velcro strip, but it can also be quite simply using a pen and a whiteboard to write out and make it clear what's happening and what's happening next. These can be really, really useful for helping with those tricky transitions. They can really help develop organisational skills. And you can be really creative and individualised in how you do this, and indeed should be. So for example, some students might like to write up their own schedule at the beginning of the day. You might sit with them and write that up together. Having a schedule like this can really help develop independent skills, reducing the need for adult input to understand what's going on and what's happening and what's going to happen next. In the bottom right hand corner there, you can see an example of how this can be adapted and developed to help an older learner, perhaps with fewer learning difficulties. And here are some more examples. I've included a picture of paper and pencil here because I do think that, sometimes we all get caught short and we don't have the materials that we need to hand, but actually just having access to a bit of paper and a pencil, being able to write out and draw out and represent visually what's happening can be really, really beneficial. And as lovely as it is, it's really lovely to have these symbols, as you see over here on the left. It's very, very, very good practice to have a finished section to put those in to show that it's finished. As wonderful as that is, it can also, we don't always have those things prepared in advance as much as we would like to. In the middle, there's a colourful timetable, there's such as you might use in secondary school. Now, of course, this schedule doesn't have to be for the whole day at all times. Within any given session, a now next or a now next and then board, also a first or then, it's the same sort of principle, can be used very successfully to help with those tricky little transitions. Not understanding when they're going to have access to the things that they like, to choosing time or to special interests, can be inherently quite stressful for autistic children and young people. So a now and next board can be really helpful at showing them when this is going to happen. The only thing I would say about this example here is you can see the child is going to do some read write ink before they can play with their blocks. The only thing I would say there is that it would need to be made very, very clear exactly what that means. What does read write ink mean in this circumstance? Does it mean finishing one worksheet? Does it mean reading 6 pages? That would need to be made explicitly clear to that child so they understand exactly what they need to do and when they will then get access to their blocks. Now, I know this is a technique, a useful tool that is seen a lot in younger learners in early years, for example, but actually it's a principle that can be applied to much older learners as well. It's just that the way that it is presented would need to be adapted or modified to be more in tune with what that learner requires. So it may need to be written out. It may be something that they don't want out on their desk because they don't want to look different to the other students in the class. So it may be something they keep in their pencil case, for example. Now, Now, a form of visual support that accompanies a visual timetable or now a next board really well is visual timers. So something that can show and really demonstrate and illustrate to that child, that young person, how long an activity is going to last for. How long are they going to engage in this piece of writing before it is finished? Or conversely, how long do they have to engage in their special interest or in their choosing activity? When will that be over? And having that visually presented, having that visual representation of that can really help reduce anxiety. It brings about predictability. And there's many ways that you can present that again to meet the needs of your learners. And another reason for using visual support is that of promoting independence. Ultimately, all of us are seeking to help our children and young people grow up to be as independent as they possibly can be. And a big part of that is us as supporting adults taking a step back. If we can find a way to present to a child or a young person exactly what it is that they need to do, then we can give them a task to complete and step back, step away, allow them to complete that independently. And that is ultimately what we're working towards. So here are some examples here, ranging from stacking rings onto a stick over to this numbered tasks, series of tasks here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, where that child can see that they have 5 little packets of work, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They need to just quietly work through those on their own before they can then go for a walk. Obviously, this will need to be very much tailored to the needs of your child. The top right there is an example of a workstation where a child would work through a series of tasks from left to right, top to bottom. There's a very clear start and end to the whole process. And adult input, again, should be kept to an absolute minimum. Here are some more examples that you might see with learners with the cognitive ability to engage in class learning tasks. These are examples of how you might present the expectations of that class task to a child or a young person, perhaps an older learner. And as you can see, it makes it really clear what needs to be done and when it's finished. And again, this is an opportunity for the adult supporting that young person to step back. And here are a couple more examples. Once again, I've put a picture of a whiteboard and pens in there because I think it's really important, again, to remember that we would love to be prepared at all times and have things at our fingertips, but sometimes we're not. And so when we're not, there is the option there of having a whiteboard, having a pen that can always go around with you, that can always go around with the young person. You can write out, you can list out what is expected in that task. For those students who need it, you can draw it out. Here's an example of how visual support can help a child become more independent in carrying out a specific task, in this case, washing hands. It breaks that task down into short stages, short steps, and they're represented visually. So recently, a lot of us, we've all been washing our hands a lot, and we have been expecting our young people that we're working with to wash their hands as well. And it's very easy to get very involved in that and help the children that we're working with to do that. What we could all consider working towards, and I think ultimately is what we would all like, is for that child to be able to wash their hands independently. So if we break down a task into these stages, represent it visually, then we can step back and teach that child how to do it independently. And this sort of principle can be applied to other things as well, like getting changed for PE or using the toilet. And again, it doesn't have to be symbols such as these widget symbols. It could be written out, it could be drawn out, it could be typed up with the child, whatever works for the child you're working with. Here's an example of type of visual support you might use to support an older learner, someone perhaps in secondary school or in Key Stage 2 at least, to organise their week. Again, we're promoting independence and we're supporting organisational skills, the development of organisational skills and planning. If you don't already do so, labelling the environment can be a really good way of promoting independence in our children and young people. If they know where things are, where they can find the materials that they need, that can be really, really positive. Likewise, labelling different rooms, labelling different environments around the school can be really helpful to, again, promote that independence and rely less on adults to help. Another reason for using visual support is that it can help give a sense of choice, a sense of ownership and autonomy. Sadly, a lot of autistic adults report that they have been much, much happier since leaving school, precisely because they have this. They have control over their day. They can choose what to engage with when. And this reduces anxiety, it reduces stress, it reduces the chances of exhaustion and burnout. So one thing we can do is incorporate choosing time or access to special and intense interests into a child's day. And representing this visually can be really, really helpful. Again, you can see from these examples how this is done will be completely dependent on your child and what works for them. So visual support can also really aid communication, both receptive and expressive, for a child or young person. Here are examples of how symbols can be presented as a communication board or in a communication book to help a child express what they can see, what they would like, how they're feeling. Again, this needs to be very carefully differentiated to meet the needs of your child. This may be far too many symbols for some children. And here's a further example. I've put an example here as well, picture of someone using some Makaton. I know lots of schools use Makaton. It can be a really effective way of, again, promoting receptive and expressive communication in autistic children and young people. Just having and using a few key signs can be really, really beneficial. Having visual support to support your verbal instructions can be very, very helpful. When you find yourself verbally prompting a child to do something hundreds of times a day, it may be worth trying a different tack. It may be that that child struggles to process that auditory input. So reducing verbal input and supporting that with visuals can really help. These are just two examples, but that principle can be applied across the board if there's something you are asking your child or young person to do. It's also worth noting that sometimes excessive kind of auditory input can in itself be very stressful for an autistic child or young person. So actually reducing that down and replacing it with some visual support can help reduce that sensory overload or the anxiety associated with not being able to process auditory information quickly enough. And visual support can also be really helpful when supporting the curriculum. So here's an example here where in a science lesson a child is looking at things that sink or float. And it's just a really lovely way of visually presenting those two ideas. Here's an example of how you might visually present planning a story, the different elements of a story and how it may come together at the end. This can really help organisation skills and planning. Here's some examples, again for some of your older learners, where potentially quite complex abstract ideas are broken down and presented visually. And here we can see some colourful semantics. If you're not already using colourful semantics, it's a really, really helpful way of helping a child to structure sentences and understand WH questions, for example. And visual support can help when distress behaviours may be starting. So most of us who've worked with autistic children and young people have sadly seen examples of these distress behaviours, which can include meltdowns or shutdowns. And when anxiety or stress is building and these distress behaviours are becoming more likely, a young person's ability to express themselves verbally or communicate in their usual style may change. They may be far less able to communicate as they were communicating with you just 2 or 3 minutes ago. So it's really helpful to give our children and young people a way to communicate with you when those distress behaviours are starting, when those anxiety levels, when those anger levels, when those stress levels are just starting to build. And here's an example of that. You may give them a way to ask for a break, to help them express to you that those feelings are building and they need a break. You may give them a visual scale to show to you how they are feeling. And there are many, many different examples of these visual scales, which you can find online or make yourself, depending on how it helps your child or young person to express themselves the best. Now, likewise, when those distress behaviours are building, when that anxiety is building, a young person's ability to understand what you are saying to them may also go right down. And in fact, having all that auditory input can contribute to the meltdown or shutdown or distress behaviour itself. It can contribute to that sensory overload or that sense of lack of control. So something we can do is have a kind of toolbox of things that we know help calm that child. And we can present that to them visually, so that when those distress behaviours are building, they know and they can communicate to you what might help them to calm, to self-regulate. And again, this is just an example. This will not be suitable for all children, but hopefully gives you an example of the sort of thing we mean. And finally, a reason for using visual support, working with our autistic children and young people, is our stress levels as professionals. None of us are robots. We all love working with these children and young people, but it can be stressful. And finding yourself repeating yourself verbally again and again and again in a day can be stressful too. So sometimes having what you're communicating presented as a visual allows you or us as professionals a chance to step back and take a breath. So it can work for stress and anxiety levels, both for that child and for professionals working with them. And here are some other reasons that we haven't covered today. As I say, this wasn't an exhaustive list. It was just an example. It was just something to give you some inspiration to take away. But other examples of visual support may be comic strip conversations and social stories. In the bottom left-hand corner there, you can see Spider-Man, and that's a power card. It's a power card strategy, which again can be useful with some of our children. It can be helpful to present reward structures visually. And down in the bottom right-hand corner is an example of a turn-taking board. Some autistic children and young people can struggle with sharing, with taking turns. So visually presenting to them when it is their turn and allowing them to see that they will get another turn can be helpful in this. Sometimes turn-taking boards like this can be presented as a circle so that a child can see that their turn will come back around. And here are some top tips. So try and make your visuals portable. It's important that a visual support that you're using in class can be taken with you, for example, to the lunch hall. A lot of autistic children and young people can struggle with the generalisation of skills. It may be that something they seem to have mastered in an intervention group, they go back to the classroom and struggle to apply it there. So having portable visual supports can really help encourage and promote that generalisation of skills. Try and make them durable, because to avoid having to make them every 5 minutes, having access to a laminator can be particularly useful here. Make them easy to access. So having a visual support is only useful to a child if they can access it and use it. So it's very easy just to get these things all together and then zip them away tidily in a folder. We want the child to be able to use them, so it's important that they can access them. And then make sure they're personalised. So as I've said before, there's no point using visual support if your child doesn't understand them. Having a key ring on a lanyard, for example, with a range of different symbols can be a really useful, really good practice way of using visual support. But again, this has to be meaningful for the child and relevant to their needs. And finally, here's a visual to represent 9 very good reasons to use visual support. As I've spoken about, visuals are permanent. Our spoken words disappear as soon as we've said them. They allow time for language processing, help with transitions, build independence, transferable between environments, so promote that generalisation of skills. They help our learners see what we mean. They don't have an attitude, there's no frustration there. They reduce anxiety. And importantly, they help all students, particularly those with special educational needs. So thank you for watching. The details of our organisation Send Success are here. You can see our website at www.sendsuccess.org.uk, and if you would like any further information, you can email us at inquiries@sendsuccess.org.uk. Thank you.